Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to Marsh McLennan's Better by Design. Thank you for everyone for joining today's discussion entitled Preparing for Shock Events. I am Peter Hearn, President and CEO of Guy Carpenter, and I'm delighted to be moderating a panel on such an interesting and timely topic. COVID and the global lockdown that followed is another example of the world being unprepared for an event that was highly predictable. Today, we're going to explore how organizations and societies are perpetually shocked when bad things happen. What else might be on the horizon that needs to be top of mind for the leaders in the audience, and our hope for what we will all learn from the experience over the last 6 months. We hope you leave here with a new perspective to help you navigate today's and tomorrow's challenges that face our organizations. Joining us today's discussion are three of Marsh McLennan's most forward-thinking thought leaders in the areas of catastrophic and emerging risk. Lara Mowery is the Global Head of Distribution of Guy Carpenter. Lara is our go-to thought leader at Guy Carpenter when it comes to helping insurers and reinsurers navigate the exposure, coverage, regulatory, and marketplace implications of major catastrophic events similar to COVID. Michael Poulos is the President of Marsh Advisory, which includes Marsh Risk Consulting, Analytics, Claims Solutions, and Captive Solutions business units. Mike's team has worked closely with clients through the pandemic, both in response to the current crisis and in building broader risk management strategies for a post-COVID world. And finally, Reid Sawyer is the head of Marsh's Emerging Risk Group. Reid's team focuses on addressing complex risks through advanced analytics and the creation of risk forecasts around a range of risks, including but not limited to cyber, pandemic, and geopolitical threats. I'll start by asking the panel a few questions and then turn it over to the audience for Q&A. Throughout the discussion, you'll be able to virtually submit your questions for consideration. On your screen, make sure you expand the right-hand side window to be able to type in your question and click Submit. We will do our very best to answer as many of the questions in a lot of time that we have. Okay, question one. When I think about the number of shocking events in the last 5 years, I wonder if we need to recondition our minds to expect bigger and more frequent surprises. How should we be thinking about the definition of a shock event? Mike, let's start with you.
Sure, Peter. Thanks. I think there's two ways that you can think about, or two definitions or senses of the word of shock that are worth keeping in mind, right? One is, an event, right, that is sudden or jolting. And the other is a surprise that is sudden or jolting. And I think that you have to keep that in mind as you think about what your preparedness level needs to be, right? An auto accident is a rare and surprising event when it happens, but that doesn't mean that seatbelts aren't any less important every time you get into a car, that all of the engineering that goes into making cars crash resistant is any less important. And I think that's really the mindset that organizations and policymakers need to bring to their strategy, which is just to keep a very open mind as to what might go wrong and to build in layers of resilience in your organization.
Reid, from your perspective, shocking events, they become more and more frequent. Your view?
Yeah, Peter, I think it's an interesting way that you framed the question, right? I mean, there was a couple of things that stood out. Was this idea that we're perpetually shocked by events over time, which suggests that we have to force ourselves to think through these types of extreme events, and this definition that Mike is talking about this, right? This disruptive, this idea of a shock event that's dislocating to us, and more importantly, I think in the way that we tend to think about it, those events that really punctuate the evolution of a trend as we think through to that point of surprise. But I think there's two other elements that you raised in your framing. One was about the shocks that are on the horizon and those that are over the horizon, right? So it's not just the shocks in the near and the midterm, but we need to take a longitudinal view to these things to be able to define them, to understand what the realm of the possible might be in sense of that, and then to be thinking about how they impact our organizations and across our value chain, and ultimately impacting our resiliency mechanisms, as Mike talked about.
Lara, in his book, David Wallace Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth, he states that what we now call catastrophic events will, in a certain period of time, be referred to as bad weather because of the changing nature of risk. And so how should we and how should our clients and participants on the call today think about the changing nature of risk relative to what we now term shocking events?
Yeah, so most organizations are striving to get this right. They're not necessarily trying to avoid dealing with this idea of the changing nature of risk. We have risk management departments in place, and we are investing tremendous effort and tremendous financial commitment to techniques to better quantify and mitigate and transfer risk. We don't ignore the fact that risk is out there, but we do tend to focus on what we know and what's in front of us, right? And so it's human nature to not necessarily be able to think through those scenarios that we haven't experienced personally, and to plan for solutions, and to believe that we're really going to be impacted by something that hasn't happened to us personally. So those big shock events, are difficult for us to say, okay, we are taking the right next steps, right? I mean, I think there's a great example. I got into the industry right before Hurricane Andrew happened. And people thought that they were prepared for a hurricane. We know hurricanes happen, but one of the most sophisticated insurance companies at that point in time, cutting edge when it came to risk management and to tracking the exposure they had to these types of events, literally approached it from the standpoint of pins in a map, right? And the framework and the state of affairs at that point in time, and that was cutting edge. So when we think about how we are going to move forward as events change, as the magnitude changes, as we become exposed to different things, we have to keep up, right? Technology, the way that we invest, the way that we approach mitigating and managing risk has to evolve, it has to change, and it has to keep up.
Thank you. Some would say that if we had proper risk management frameworks in place, there would not be this repeated shock by what happens. Where do you think the most common causes of failure are? And who do you think has gotten it right over time? Lara, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I do think the most common causes of failure are the fact that we haven't experienced some of these things that happen, and we have this delicate balance that we have to maintain between allocating resources to these things that might be way out there in our minds on the time horizon in order to be prepared and to respond to these things, and allocating our limited resources to the things that we see sort of right in front of us day in, day out. I know I have to take care of being able to respond to this exposure because I've seen it happen to my business, or I've seen it happen to my employees. And so there's limited time in our days. There's limited money for us to dedicate to these things. And it's very, very difficult to say, I'm going to have a plan that responds to something that might just be too big to wrap my arms around. And so when we think about how do we get this right, I go back to that example with Hurricane Andrew of that company who had the push pins in the map. They thought they were getting it right. And a lot of our risk managers, if we go back to before COVID happened, we felt like we'd gotten a lot of things right. If we go back to before 9/11 happened, we thought we had a lot of things right. But then something happens in a way that we haven't expected, right? And that's always the crux of it. Every time a big event happens, it happens in a way we don't expect. Andrew happened in a way that we didn't expect. Tohoku happened in a way that we didn't necessarily expect, even though it was an event everybody knew and had prepared for that type of occurrence, right? And so that's, I think, one of the biggest things is trying to imagine for us almost the unimaginable and then allocating resource to respond to it.
I think if I could just build on that
Michael,
point that Lara was just making about one's own experience. But as I reflect back on the sort of global reaction to the COVID crisis, I think that the experience of different authorities at the policy level certainly colored their reactions, right? And so to just be very general about it, right? Asia had a lot of experience with pandemic from, going back to at least to the first SARS, recent experience in the memory of incumbent policymakers. And they reacted in a very different way in terms of their ability to roll out testing, their ability to do invasive contact tracing, where there was actually a political will in the population to allow that to happen. And that was something that we had less experience with in at least the United States. Canada was affected by SARS and was a bit more nimble than the United States. What the United States had a lot of experience with was the global financial crisis from 2008 and 2009. And the ability that the U.S. had from a policy perspective to react to the financial aspects of this crisis was really quite adroit. There was more stimulus in the first monetary stimulus in the first 6 weeks of this crisis than there was in the first 2 years of the global financial crisis, which is really quite extraordinary. So I do believe that that if you can broaden the frame of experience that you consider when you're planning for crises, or you can avoid these failures of imagination that Lara was talking about.
So Reid, a number of people have said to me, the COVID-19 as a black swan or as a shocking event. Was the shock the actual virus, or was the shock global government's response to a global pandemic,
or perhaps the lack thereof in the latter, and in the latter case? I think perhaps it's and this really kind of connects to both Mike and Lara's comments, right? It's less of a black swan. I mean, we should have seen this coming with our experience between MERS and SARS and previous epidemics that were, perhaps just a hair away from becoming a pandemic in their own right, especially given some of the impacts that we've seen that have impacted other countries and those prior events, in the way to the extreme that they were. So it's really less a failure of prediction than it's a failure to account for and understand what those past events were. It sort of is probably the treatise on surprise and of events was a book written around Pearl Harbor, and the tagline that came from it was failure to anticipate effectively, right? It's how do I understand what it is that I'm looking at, and how do I think about it? And I think, Peter, to the heart of your question to me is, a lot of times when we're looking at these rare events, which by their definition are difficult to model because they're rare, right, to some extreme, and to understand, as Lara, as you said, right, this whole point, difficult to understand in the ways they'll unfold. We tend to, when we do ask the right questions, we tend to become almost myopically focused on the direction of change, right? Will this epidemic become a pandemic? And yet we miss, to the point of your question, Peter, this idea of the second important question is, what's the rate of change? And how do we think about velocity of risk as it impacts our organizations? And, as much as the analysts spend time focused on the first, on direction of change, we have to remember the velocity of risk provides in another variable that is oftentimes unaccounted for as we think through these extreme events.
Mike, you talk about it in your on-demand speaker talk, but what's been surprising to you over the course of this pandemic?
Look, I think the before I get to that, Peter, it's a great question, but I just to push back a little bit on Reid's point about a lack, or the quip he made about a lack of response on the part of the authorities. I think we made different decisions around the world. The authorities made different decisions around the world about how to react to the crisis. And if you look at, say, Taiwan, they reacted with great alacrity with respect to the epidemiological crisis. And they cut off travel from China first. They had the most invasive contact tracing, et cetera, et cetera. They did not shut down. And Japan did not shut down. And, obviously, famously, Sweden made very different choices. We made a conscious decision in other Western countries to essentially substitute a greater economic shock to mitigate the epidemiological shock, right? That was a big experiment, right? And I think it will be years, if not decades, before we really can look back and evaluate it with a clear bit of hindsight. And so that we had the ability to make that decision because we are a much richer nation than we were in 1957 or 1968. And we also, I think, as a country or a society in the West, have lower tolerance for risk right now, at least certain kinds of risk, and more financial resources. And so we made this crisis into something really quite different, even though from a death toll perspective, on a population adjusted basis, is not any worse in the United States than the epidemics in 57 and 68.
Okay. So back to my question, Mike, what's been surprising over the course of this pandemic to you?
I think what's been the most surprising is the rate at which the things that had been unimaginable became really quite imaginable very quickly. So I remember watching the president's speech when he instituted the travel ban to Europe, and I thought, even at that hour, I thought that was really quite shocking. It was only a few months before when Boris Johnson was having trouble effecting Brexit and had to call an election in order to actually make Brexit happen. And then a few months later, there's a travel ban between the U.S. And Europe, and then a few weeks after that, Germany closes its borders to the EU. So the degree to which people's imagination had to expand really quite quickly was probably the most surprising to me over the course of this crisis. And frankly, I think it's been one of the more encouraging aspects of the crisis. I mean, the amount of innovation that's happened in the last 6 months medically has been really quite astounding.
So, Peter, if I could jump in here, just
Sure.
follow-up points actually to what Michael just commented on. One, I do think that it's been astonishing the degree to which people's imaginations have had to expand, and what we just sort of now take as a matter of course in our day. The fact that we're doing this virtually, the fact that we've, as a globe, have been conducting business virtually, the fact that there's almost no travel or incredibly reduced travel, the fact that for weeks in a lot of countries or months in a lot of countries, people didn't just go out to dinner. These are really fundamental changes in our day-to-day routines. And we sort of picked up and said there are things that need to happen. There's work that needs to get done, and jumped in and started trying to figure out how to do it and come up with solutions and think about the ways in which we move forward, which leads into my second comment, Mike, on something you said before that section around how different countries made different choices as to how to deal with this pandemic. And we made it into something that was a crisis of a bit of a different sort. A different choice could have led to a different outcome in terms of what really defined the crisis. But I think that's probably going to happen with any shock event. there's no clear path forward for any of these types of events necessarily that we're talking about. Solutions haven't been tried and tested because these aren't things that are sitting at the forefront of our minds and understanding. So we are going to make mistakes, or we're going to make choices that people second guess. And we can't be afraid of implementing solutions or trying something to fix the problems now, because we're afraid they're going to turn out to be mistakes, right? That kind of thinking leads to inaction. And we do need to do some more work around embracing, you know what, this may not turn out to be the right path, but we took a path and we tried something.
So Lara, on that point, that leads to my next question is what impact do you think COVID will have on the mindsets of organizations and leaders and governments as they develop risk management or resilience strategies?
Yeah, well, I do hope it does have an impact, and that we become a little bit more flexible about the idea that it doesn't take an event, it doesn't take a crisis for us to be more proactive about coming up with solutions, about allocating some of our limited time and our limited financial resources to trying to change things now, before that catastrophic event or that shock event happens, and committing at least some small section of your day or your week, or the amount of dollars you have at your disposal to really focusing on, what do I think is critical? What do I think that shock event that's going to impact my business, or the people who work for me, or the environment overall is going to look like, and how do I allocate dollars to help be part of the solution, or how do I allocate time to help be part of the solution?
Reid, your views?
Yeah, I think the question as we think about that is really going to be, and to that point that Lara that you're making is how do we make those right choices and then evaluate those over different time horizons. And it sounds so simple, right? And it almost sounds pedestrian when I hear myself say it, but yet it's really that about how do we stress test our organizations, but also doing so across the value chain, because we've seen that organizations that do it between their distribution, their supply, their customers, and even their competitors, and they really push themselves to think through that range of events and those branches and sequels, Lara, that you're talking about, right? That's when that clarity about now evaluating the opportunity cost about where to make those investments in resiliency and how to think through. And I would suggest it's really even, Peter, redefining what our metrics are by which we judge a resilient organization, and then thinking about how to bring those metrics in a way that the board is not left with the same 9 box of risk that they've stared at for the last 7 quarters, where cyber is always in that upper right-hand corner but doesn't move, but really challenging boards, directors, and officers of our own organizations, our clients, to think about what metrics really then can matter and drive that change, Lara, that you're talking about.
So, Mike, you working on the old adage of never waste a crisis. What lessons are we learning, and what do we want to keep, and what do we want to take forward?
Right. Well, I think we're learning a lot about one of the things that I think is in common between this crisis and the last one, the global financial crisis, is that when things stop working, it's when you really start to understand how they worked in the first instance, right? And so thinking about the experience that you had going through this crisis, how did it affect you financially? How did it affect your supply chains? How did it affect your ability to deliver? How did it affect demand? And thinking through those different shocks to a business model, even if the impetus isn't the same in the next crisis, say, well, what would happen if I had this this disruption to my supply chain? I think that will really help to prepare more for future crises. But to the point Lara was making, it will always look expensive in good times to be prepared for a crisis, whether you're building redundancy into a supply chain, or you're holding more capital, or you're making some other sort of investment. And I think it really is incumbent on executives to engage your shareholder constituencies with on those topics, right? Because there will always be a push. The natural push will be towards efficiency and make things as cheap as possible, to be just in time, to be offshoring to the cheapest location. If you're not engaging with your shareholder constituencies on the topic of resilience and redundancy, then and that could go all the way down to your capital structure, to say, this is what we're ready for. These are the cushions that we're building in, because we don't know when it's going to happen, but it will eventually happen. I think that's what, that's really important part of crisis management is shareholder management.
On that same theme, for all three of you, as we look into the future, what are you questioning? What's worrying to you, and what gives you hope? Mike, you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'll start with the hope part. What gives me hope is I do actually think that we now have a generation of managers that has lived through a number of significant crises, big geopolitical crises, financial crises, and now this global pandemic. And so I think that there's a built-in base of experience, again, to return to Lara's theme, that is really going to help us be more prepared for what comes down the pike. I do think what is worrying to me is the degree to which at least in the West and particularly the United States, the degree to which the management of this crisis has become politicized. And to Lara's point about being nimble through a crisis and learning, the degree to which people have become invested in certain strategies and don't want to back off of them even as circumstances change. I think that has been, I think, really disappointing to me. I mean, if we fought wars, if we'd fought the Second World War with the level of polarization that we're bringing to this crisis, it would have been an uglier outcome for sure. So I really hope that we can get past that. I know it's an election year, and it's a polarizing environment. For all kinds of reasons, I hope that we can get to a place where we have a more constructive political dialogue, because we need our policymakers to be able to act in the best interest of the whole polity.
Lara, as we look ahead, what's worrying to you? Mike talked about what hope, and from a worry standpoint, what's worrying to you?
I think what's worrying is, do we, a year out of this crisis, 2 years out of this crisis, revert back to the same behaviors as before the crisis? We tend to have very short memories when it comes to these things. Once you get past the immediate, this is having an impact on my life, we need to be better prepared in the future sort of mindset and framework, and you're not being directly affected any longer, it starts to fade in importance away from the immediacy. And there are events out there that are really significant shock events that haven't happened in our lifetimes, that very likely could happen in our lifetimes, and that we need to apply this same level of thought process around. An example, Jakarta is one of the fastest sinking cities in the world. And part of that is climate change and rising sea level. Part of that is self-created, right? Or man-made, in that they're removing tremendous amounts of groundwater from underneath the city, and it's causing it to sink. They had a comment or a position that I thought was really striking when they were talking about the solutions around what you do when a city the size and magnitude and scope of Jakarta is sinking. And the comment was, we know exactly what the solutions are. The hard part is the will to implement them. And that probably applies to a lot of the framework that we can look at around shock events. We know what a lot of the solutions that we need to implement are, but really difficult to take some of those actions in practice and long term to continue those actions.
Reid, what are you questioning about the future?
Yeah, I think I would pick up on this last theme of will we return to the past too quickly first. Second, I think is I'm concerned that if we don't, right, will the pull of this crisis lead organizations to have really great pandemic preparedness plans and a lot of details that aren't necessarily built in a way that organizations can respond to these other crises we haven't seen or haven't imagined yet, right? Like this myopic focus. And I think as we think about that future, I'm exceptionally worried because of this perhaps myopic view on non-correlated risks, right? The fragility that exists in our system and the fact that supply chains can be hit, by a cyber attack at the same time our workforce is being stretched by working from home from the pandemic, as we're dealing with an active hurricane season, right? And so getting our arms around this vantage point of not racing to yesterday, thinking forward, and then imagining these non-correlated risks, I think is really going to be important.
I mean, I think Lara raises a good point about rising sea level. I was in Miami last year, and on the king tide, which is a full moon and high tide, Miami Beach, South Beach floods. And I happened to be meeting with some engineers and some individuals from the Army Corps of Engineers. And I said, what's the solution? And they said, well, they're talking about a $9 billion seawall. I said, well, wow, that's expensive. How long would that take? And they said, by the time we finish completing the seawall, the water may have breached the seawall. So, there's real and there's insidious threats as well. I want to get back to a point that we talked about a little earlier, which is a global pandemic is something that many predicted would happen. We even had previous scares, as we talked about, in the form of MERS and SARS. And viruses have been with mankind for, all throughout history. And I guess my question to you guys are, what shock events are people ignoring today that are most likely to occur in the short to medium term? Reid, let's start with you.
Sure. I think that the clear answer, at least for me, and perhaps due to my own myopic approach, is the first, it has to be around technology and cyber risk. Right? There's almost as much fatigue around cyber threats, I think, as there is these days about COVID-19. But despite that fatigue, right, the pervasiveness of the technology threats, the rampant rise of these threats, the way that we've digitized almost every business that exists, right, that we think of, we really need to be focused on these types of cascading events, not dissimilar perhaps to NotPetya or WannaCry that we saw a couple of years ago, right? Computer viruses that swept 65 countries in the span of less than 48 hours. But what happens when that is truly critical, key infrastructure systems, or creates those types of cascading events? Peter, I think that the second category that I'm concerned about is more geopolitical in nature, and that's, is there going to be a reshaping of the Middle East as we come out of this crisis? The way that Iran has been impacted with its senior leaders, some of the critical players being impacted by it, the stability of countries like Egypt or Lebanon, right, the fall of oil prices and the remittances, if you will, that come back into Jordan and some of these other places. I think there's a lot for us to be thinking about, again, these second and third order effects that could have very long lasting implications for us as we think through some of those. And again, tied to COVID-19 and this pandemic, yet distinct and separate in their own right. And then finally, maybe the third one, and this is sort of the in the dark of the night, the nightmare scenario that keeps me up is have the terrorists, which we seem to have forgotten about in 2020, have the terrorists learn something about bio warfare and the way that this can be conducted. In 2002, 2003, there was a lot of research that we were sponsoring about genetically modified biological terrorist weapons, right? Can you target one race versus another? But what happens when you're dealing with something like SARS or MERS or COVID-19, and can you weaponize this and deploy this, as we saw some early instances of non-terrorist organizations doing, but people really trying to bring about sort of the second coming, if you will, through the infection rates and sparking that amongst their population. So certainly three categories to be thinking about, but I think the first has to start with cyber.
Mike, we talked about second and third order events when we were briefing ourselves on this panel discussion, and I'd just like to get your insight on your concerns about potential second and third order events that could influence shock events as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, I think just to sort of build on some of the points that Reid was just making, and then like into that question, it's really not any one of these things, right? It's a confluence of, we're in a very a highly sort of dynamic geopolitical landscape. I mean, the Cold War kind of had us in stasis for a very long period of time, but right now you have the Middle East in flux. For a lot of reasons, not least of which is the sort of transformation of the energy economy around the world. You have there's really no comparison between the size of the Chinese economy and their aspirations to be a sort of a dominant, at least regional power, and obviously a co-equal global power to the United States. It's very different now than it was even 20 years ago in terms of their ability to act on that. You put that together with cyber, you put that together with potentially bio weapons or rogue nuclear weapons, right? And I kind of think about these things as all being kind of less individual threats and more things that sort of reinforce one another in terms of making any one of them more likely to be realized, and that I think is just an important nuance to think about, as opposed to thinking about the first order effect of what would happen if there were a bioterrorism event or if there were a rogue nuclear event.
Okay, last question. What's your bold prediction for how COVID will change behaviors as it relates to risk management, resilience, or not, as the case may be? Lara, let's start with you.
Yeah, so Peter, I'll jump into that in a second, but just to respond to Mike and Reid, that was pretty dark, right? That last few minutes. I would also say that there are just plain old-fashioned natural disasters that we also don't necessarily prepare for, because they're not the kinds of things that are on the radar screen every day. And I know I shared with you an event that just came up in a Wired magazine article, of all places. They were detailing the Great Flood in California that occurred in 1861. And doing further research on that, what they found was every 100 to 200 years, like clockwork for the last 1,800 years, the Central Valley in California has flooded to a magnitude of 10 to 15 to 20 feet of water across the entire Central Valley. So that's 25% of the United States food supply from 1% of the viable landmass, underwater and unusable and wiped out. And
a lot of the rest of the world too.
And a lot of the rest of the world, right? So what kind of knock-on effect does an event like that have? We're overdue for the event. And climate change research indicates it's now 3 times more likely to happen than it has been. And nobody talks about that event, right? We think about the Central Valley as being drought exposed, not needing flood insurance. So the amount of financial preparedness around this type of event is minimal, absolutely. So I think there's a wide range of these things, and when you say what's a bold prediction, I think for me a bold prediction would be that we really see a tangible and long-lasting shift in behavior, that we don't revert back, and that we use COVID and what's happened as a call to action for all of these potential shock events that Reid and Mike and myself have talked about.
Mike, Reid, any Any comments?
I guess I'll end on a somewhat sunnier note. And again, to come back to this idea of how much we've learned in the course of the last 6 months. Like, it has been remarkable, right? The degree to which we have been able to react. And obviously, every sector of the economy has been very different. But when I think about how our own company was able to pivot to working remotely, basically over a weekend. It's really quite remarkable. When I think about how much medical progress has been made in the last 6 months, it's really quite remarkable. And so, what I would say is that bad things will happen. They have happened, right? We've probably, I'm going to be 50 next month. In my lifetime, I feel like I've gotten off light in the crisis department, and so. I think that, but I do think that we have a remarkably dynamic society and we're a very wealthy society. And I think that when you put together the dynamism and the wealth, that we really do have a lot of flexibility that's created by that. And I would say the best crisis preparedness would just be to make sure that we don't undermine those key those key advantages that have helped us come through this crisis, and indeed have come through, I think, most of the major crises in history, and we can leverage the creativity and industry of a very wide range of people across the society. And so that would be the one bit of crisis management advice that I would give to policymakers. And I think that our ability to sort of, maybe sometimes in spite of ourselves, come up with creative solutions, I think has really been remarkable.
Can I turn now? We've had a number of questions come in from the audience, and I'd just like to avail them to you for your feedback as well. Reid, let's start with you. Do you think the issue is a failure of risk management or having too much tolerance for risk?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Peter. I don't know that it's so much of I don't know that it's so much a failure of risk management. I think the risk management systems have actually performed like we've asked them to do, right? Like we build risk registers, we report to the audit committees, we're asking them to do what they've been designed to do. So the question is have we designed the right systems to be able to accommodate for these types of shock events that we've been talking about for the past hour or so? And the answer to that question is no. So if that's failure, then I would argue that it is a failure of risk management to a degree. But part of that, I think, and interestingly enough, in the way the question was framed, is it probably is tied a little bit to this tolerance of risk management. Again, it's, as Mike alluded to earlier, right? This real drive for efficiency over resiliency in the past, and how we see these forward. So I think we need to move beyond sort of a process governance driven framework around risk management to much more of a dynamic set of measures, building of intelligence layers into this system for decision makers to be able to understand the variety of these shocks. And as Laura rightly points out, there's a lot of other events that are happening every day that companies have to deal with. And so to be able to evaluate those trade-offs.
So to that point, Mike, we just raised it, and you raised it earlier. This question has come in. Has there been too much of a focus by organizations on efficiency at the expense of resilience? And is that true for all companies and industries?
Well, look, I think that there's certainly, I mean, one of the great stories of policy and business of the last 30 or 40 years has definitely been this drive for efficiency, going back to, the just-in-time revolution and global supply chains, and the continuous sort of globalization of the world economy. And we basically accepted a lot of fragility in our business operating models that was predicated on essentially nothing going wrong. So has there been? I mean, I guess you could say in retrospect there has been too much. Having said that, again, I think this comes back to the question of what kind of a dialogue are managers having with their shareholder constituencies. I mean, generally speaking, that happened because that's what shareholders were asking for. There was a bank CEO who said right before, or right at the beginning of the financial crisis, as long as the music's paying, you've got to get up and dance. When your shareholders are asking you, why aren't you growing as fast as the next guy, then you have to have a good answer. And I think that, to me, is, I don't know if it's a failure of risk management. It's definitely a failure of articulation to all the stakeholders about what the stakes are. And what is the time horizon over which you're optimizing? Because a quarter is very different from a year, is very different from a decade, and there are trade-offs that need to be made between resiliency and efficiency sometimes, or certainly lowest cost. And so it's like everything else; it has to be held in balance.
Lara, here's one that is particularly germane to the work that you've been doing lately. How should we think about the balance of responsibility to manage shock events between individuals, organizations, governments, both locally and globally?
Yeah, this is part of it, and Mike, I think you're probably going to want to weigh in on this one too, right? But a lot of the order of magnitude, right, that we're talking about, and particularly for something like a pandemic, this really is the first time in our lifetimes that we're dealing with a global correlation of an event on a massive scale across industries, across geographies, in ways that we just hadn't thought through and predicted and prepared for. And we have to partner in order to reach solutions for any of these types of events that we're talking about, right? And some of this gets to a comment that Mike made earlier on expanding our thinking. So, somebody working on solutions over here for something completely unrelated to the projects that you're working on over here, and perspectives that you bring from being part of a government agency and having government resources to perspectives in being a scientist in a private lab. I mean, any and all of that really needs to come together for some of these big solutions that, taken individually, if we as an individual company or we as an individual person is trying to think, okay, I have to do something to affect a change, or I have to do something to find a solution, it's too big. We can't take these things on that way. And so this idea of trying to find harmony and collaboration and partnerships is essential. Some of that goes to also starting to shift our mindsets, because we have been, I think, very focused on this idea of my company's success and how do I move forward in achieving that, and those very narrow set of goals, rather than what does that mean more broadly? What does that mean in terms of the impact of my decisions on climate change, or whatever it might be? And so this just general idea that we have to expand our ways of thinking, expand the types of people we reach out to for solutions, or even just to communicate with and talk through problems, is going to be critical.
Mike, you got about a minute and a half, and then we're going to have to jump to the closing question.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is that there's, ideally what you would like is to have decisions and consequences be as close to the issue as possible, right? And you can afford that with relatively small or contained decisions, right? So what should be the capital structure of my small company, or where should I where should I build my house? If there's one individual making that decision who can bear the consequence, that's terrific. When you get to these big systemic risks with high correlation, right? That's where governments end up getting involved, because there isn't a private entity that can absorb it, and there isn't the political will to let things happen. Or maybe there's a big externality, like the whole economy is going to fall apart if you let the banking system fall apart, or whatever. So you're going to get in. If you're going to imagine situations where the government has to get involved as the backstop. It is always better to have some kind of public-private mechanism where at least the individuals in mediating institutions, whether that's an insurance company or a bank, has some skin in the game and says, okay, we could have a situation where the government just always bears 100% of pandemic risk, or we could say, look, the government might have to, in a worst case scenario, absorb 90 or 95%. But if we have skin in the game in the private sector, people will behave differently, and they will harden their their businesses or their personal situations or their balance sheets in such a way to absorb some part of that shock. And that, I think, there's an opportunity for us to come out of this and do and leverage our learning so that the next time it doesn't have to be nearly 100% of a government response. And maybe it won't be as bad because we'll have made different kinds of investments coming in the run-up.
Reid, anything to add to that before we get to our closing question?
No, that's fine. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, our closing question: if you could have an organization, excuse me, government or society implement one measure to limit the damage caused by shock events, what would it be? Now, we've touched on a lot during the course of the past hour, but if there was one that you would put your finger on, what would it be, Reid?
Wow, that's a phenomenally big question, Peter. I think it would have to be along the lines not dissimilar from Michael what you just described. There's got to be some cost sharing basis where all parties are bearing and have that as multiple people have now put its skin in the game to be able to preserve both balance sheet and opportunity to drive towards those solution sets, because right now it's just we're far too optimized in terms of, Laura, as you put it, right, my company, my quarter, my results, my shareholders versus our ability. So we've got to create some, at the risk of sounding like I'm moving towards a different political system, and I'm not suggesting that at all, but some sort of collectivism around how we understand systemic risks and how we treat those.
I got one other question that came up. I want to mention it because I think it's kind of interesting. It says, does the panel think that the prevalence of benchmarking made it easy for people to rationalize that no action for shock events was the right outcome? Lara, why don't you take that one on?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, actually, because if you look at it in the context of the way that we manage natural perils, the fact that a company can look at that management around natural peril risk and say, there's a set of guidelines in place. There's a set of rules in place that I know I have to follow. And that's what I do, right? And when I follow that set of guidelines, that's justification for not then having to step outside that and make the harder decisions to, beyond my senior management team's expectations or my shareholders' expectations, make a bigger financial commitment to something else, right? If I know this is what I have to do, I've met that set of criteria, and that applies very broadly. And we see companies managing to that mindset all the time. The other thing that goes into that is not, I don't want to have to make the hard decisions, but somebody has thought very deeply and long and hard about this and come up with a formal framework. They know more about it than I do. Why should I second guess that's the right decision to manage my level of risk? And so I am going to follow that benchmark, because why would I know better than somebody else?
Do you think, Mike, do you think the insurance industry has an obligation to better educate the public with respect to the potential for shock events?
Well, certainly, I mean, people tend to underestimate the likelihood of rare events, right? That's a documented phenomenon. There's a book called "Fooled by Randomness" by this Nicholas Taleb, who wrote "The Black Swan" and a couple other interesting books. So, to the extent that we can help the broader society become more numerate with respect to what the implications are, of sort of outlier events. I think that there are very few parts of the economy where are better positioned in terms of being aware of them and have more skin in the game. So I would say yes. I think it's in our interest to help our clients sort of harden their own defenses, if you will, against these kinds of outlier events, and we're in a good position to do that.
Reid, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's critical. I think it goes to the point that this unique role in which the insurance industry sits within the economy of understanding both taking the risk, financing the risk, and understanding from the client perspective. It's a rare intersection of insight, and I think with that comes not just the opportunity to inform, but really the obligation to inform.
Mike and Lara, I didn't ask you for your if there was one measure to limit the damage caused by shock events, what would it be? So if you could give me your input on both of you on that would be a great way to end.
You want to go first, Lara?
Sure. I think it's right exactly, Peter, along the lines of what we've been talking about. And this doesn't fix things or provide the exact answer, but education is absolutely critical in this process. Educating policymakers so they understand what's really on the line when they're making those harder decisions, and then educating their constituents so that the constituents understand why decisions have been made. And, it's not about taking something away. It's about trying to make the right decisions for the greater good, if you will. I just think education is critical.
I guess what I would say is, if it were that easy, we wouldn't really have crises, would we? Right? There's not really a silver bullet out there that is going to save us. If I look back across crises, I would say the two things that seem to help, whether it's a country or an economy or a company, to emerge from them. One is financial flexibility. So I think growth, if you're managing economy, is paramount, and then having a certain amount of conservatism in finance if you're managing a company, and then I would say sort of distributed capabilities, right? Whether that's distributed decision making, or having a certain amount of redundancy in your operating model. That's another thing that just really allows for creativity to happen at a more accelerated pace in the moment. You won't be able to anticipate anything that might happen, but if you have the financial wherewithal to withstand the initial shock and the sort of nimbleness that comes from distributed capabilities, then you're faster. You'll be faster to emerge.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have, and I want to thank Lara and Mike and Reid for offering your perspective and insight. It's left us much to ponder about for the future. To our participants, thank you for joining another live session with us. We encourage you to explore the other exciting live and on-demand sessions happening over the course of the event. As you exit, please take the survey for this session. To access the survey, please scroll down in your window beyond the video screen and click on post-session survey, the post-session survey icon, I beg your pardon. Your input and response will be used to co-create a report for the future. And with that, we'd like to close this session. And again, I'd like to send my sincere appreciation to all of you for your participation today. Thank you.